Are you autistic but hide your autism diagnosis for fear of being rejected for not being autistic enough? Maybe you're not autistic and have responded with skepticism to someone's autistic revelation because they look and act normal. This is a common occurrence for autistic people who also have average or above average intelligence. So today I want to talk about how intelligence can mask autism and why intelligence does not guarantee low support needs in any autistic person. Hi, I'm Phil, a late diagnosed autistic older adult, and it's my goal to advocate for autistic adults by providing positive science-based information about autism and by sharing some of my own stories along the way. So first up, let's define a few things so we can all start on the same page. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disability affecting areas of communication, thinking patterns, and sensory sensitivities. An autistic person might have difficulties in social contexts with back and forth communication, leading to overwhelm and subsequent avoidance of these interactions, difficulties forming relationships, and even isolation. The autistic brain works in subtly different ways to the non-autistic brain, which can lead to rigid patterns of thinking, literal interpretations, restricted intense interests, and repetitive thoughts and behaviours. Autistic people also often experience the senses in more extreme ways, leading to oversensitivities and undersensitivities in any of the sensory systems. Autism is lifelong and can't be caught or cured. The autistic brain is different, but not less than. Autism can be present in people of all levels of intelligence. When we talk about intelligence, we often refer to IQ or intelligence quotient. The intelligence quotient is a standardised score given to indicate where an individual sits within an entire population statistically. With all statistical populations of what is known as normal distribution, the range of values can be represented as a bell curve, with the highest point of the bell curve representing the average or mean of all possible values. As the shape of the curve suggests, the majority of the population sits close to this mean or average figure and evenly distributed in both directions above or below the mean. When considering intelligence, the mean has been assigned a value of 100, with higher values representing higher IQ and lower values representing lower IQ. As we move away from the mean, we can see the relative numbers under the curve decreases substantially, leaving a long tail of outliers in each direction. This majority in regards to IQ infers that normal intelligence sits between 85 and 115, or in statistical terms, one standard deviation from the mean. There is much more in the way of statistical analysis that we could describe at this point, and indeed I want to come back to this bell curve in a future podcast, but for now that probably gives enough background to make a start. An important point to make here before we move on, however, is in regard to how IQ scores are measured. This is done by using standardised tests, and it's also worth noting that while these tests are designed to measure thinking, they can also be biased with the individual's knowledge. This can bias results relative to background, with people in developed countries potentially scoring higher due to this knowledge bias, although modern versions of IQ tests are designed to minimise this bias. In relation to autistic people, the bias can work negatively also, as the tests also bias towards verbal reasoning and away from the abstract reasoning more typically demonstrated in autistic individuals, with autistic people scoring up to 30 points higher on non-verbal abstract reasoning tests. Now, traditionally, when we talk about autism, we have referred to functional capacity with terms like high functioning and low functioning to represent how severely an individual might be affected. These terms are no longer as widely used, as they imply more about the individual than might be factual. For instance, to say someone is high functioning might downplay their significant daily struggles. Likewise, to say someone is low functioning might be to write them off and not recognise their individual value. But I've talked about that elsewhere, so I won't labour that point here. What is more commonly talked about now is the support each autistic individual may need. with level 1 being requiring support, level 2 requiring substantial support, and level 3 requiring very substantial support. And importantly, we can see from this that all autistic people require support. When we start to consider intelligence combined with functioning and required support, it would be tempting to consider that autistic individuals with higher intelligence must logically also require less support than those with lower intelligence. But this is not always the case. Indeed, it is possible to have a high IQ and also be a very high supports needs, level 2 or above autistic individual. As a child, I was tested for IQ because of the learning difficulties I was experiencing, and ironically, I tested at greater than 3 standard deviations above the mean. But as part of my autism diagnosis in adulthood, I was identified as having severe autism symptoms. This combination of above average IQ and severe autism symptoms means I still need substantial or level 2 support in my daily life. Now, I'm not going to put a number against that IQ score, as it was a very long time ago, but let me say here that I certainly don't feel smart, especially as I look out at the world from a position of very real daily struggles with how I move out into that world. As someone who has more or less lost the ability to work in a conventional employment type setting, I certainly don't feel smart. And this is a reality for many autistic people. And this is where the disability aspect of being autistic really hits home. This is also where labels like Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism start to fall down. If we look at Asperger's syndrome for a start, the assumption is that the individual has low support needs because they also have average or above average intelligence, with the common misconception being, "You're smart, you'll figure it out." As we've just seen, intelligence alone is not a reliable metric for the level of support autistic people may need. Likewise with the label high-functioning autism as another term with equivalence to Asperger's syndrome, describing an autistic person of average or above average intelligence with low support needs. It does not start to cover people who exhibit both high intelligence but with moderate to high support needs. And that leaves people like me out in the cold. Again, this is why the 3 levels of support are an appropriate way to differentiate between autistic people. To say this another way, differentiating autistic people based on real or perceived intelligence or by some arbitrary score is more damaging than useful. Just like labelling someone who has higher than average intelligence with one flavour of autism, labelling someone who may have lower perceived intelligence as low functioning is also damaging. Labels like this lead to assumptions that these individuals don't have the capacity to achieve or contribute in any meaningful way. This is disrespectful and just plain wrong. With appropriate opportunity and support, all autistic people can find their place within the wider society. Another significant barrier that autistic people with higher intelligence face is that this high intelligence can substantially mask our autism. This can mean that an autism diagnosis might get missed entirely or at least not occur until later in life, leading to the missed opportunity for significantly needed support through childhood, adolescence, and indeed into adulthood. In my case, as a child, my dyslexia was significant, but because my memory and pattern recognition were excellent, I was masking my inability to read in my mid-primary school years by faking it. Now, I was not aware that what I was doing was in fact any different to how the other kids were reading, but eventually it did come to the attention of one of my teachers who bluntly informed my parents of my inability to read. So it was on discovery of this fact that I was tested for learning difficulties and intelligence. And this is where the dichotomy of my learning challenges became apparent as I powered through a variety of IQ tests, which made my reading challenges all the more baffling. Now, this was the mid-1970s, and the concepts of both dyslexia and autism were so mired in historical stereotypes that both of those diagnoses were not a consideration due to my apparent high IQ. So my parents supported my learning personally, as they were both teachers, and good ones. I grew up and moved through my school years well supported despite not having any understanding of either my autism, dyslexia, or indeed my ADHD. So my example certainly shows that higher IQ can help in masking autism. But the reality is that masking does not lessen the dominant aspects of autism. It only hides the impacts from other people. Core autistic challenges such as social difficulties, sensory sensitivities, and emotional regulation remain untouched by IQ scores. Added to this is the high prevalence of associated conditions such as anxiety, depression, and as we mentioned earlier, ADHD and dyslexia. So again, while all these conditions may be a part of the autistic person's daily experience, it may also be that the subsequent and very significant effects may be substantially masked by high IQ. And this clearly leads external observers to the conclusion that these higher IQ autistic individuals are high functioning, or other dismissive terms like autism light. Like very many other autistic people, my sensory challenges are a daily struggle. Even my limited social interactions can be difficult. And as I get to understand more about myself through this journey, I realise that my anxiety is very often off the scale, despite having what most people would describe as a very laid-back personality. So yes, I definitely mask all of these things heavily. Another key factor to consider at this point is how the stereotypes of autism that are prevalent in the wider community might uniquely impact autistic people with higher IQ. Firstly, and again as we alluded to earlier, is the fact that autism was classically described in young white boys with intellectual disability, who often are also nonverbal. These presentations of autism are due to the fact that early studies were done on boys in institutional settings where intellectual disability was common. So for many people, that image straight away precludes people of higher intelligence, adults, people of colour, and women. Now we know that autism is distributed across all genders, ages, races, backgrounds, and intelligence, but much of the community is still ignorant about this simple fact. That means that for not just higher intelligence, but indeed for any autistic person who is not a young white boy, that our experiences may largely be dismissed. And of course, we must also not dismiss the experience of autistic people with intellectual disability while having discussion about higher IQ, as their experience is also valid and their support needs typically high. The contrary stereotype that can also be damaging is that autistic people are all geniuses or have superpowers in some way. While it is true that some autistic people are in fact geniuses or may have certain abilities due to a different way of thinking or even just plain hard work or study of a special interest, this skewed perception of autistic people has largely come about through popularisation of autism from certain TV shows or movies depicting autistic characters in this way. Now, while these characterisations do depict many common autistic traits, they are often overplayed as the prime goal is entertainment rather than education. And dramatic characters, regardless of neurotype, are often created to be interesting or extreme, as that is what sells the premise of the show. Where this can create problems for autistic people is when these characters become the dominant image or portrayal of autism in society. This leads to the expectation that all autistic people must have some form of genius, talent, or superpower, when the reality is we mostly look like the rest of the population, especially as many of us mask our autistic traits heavily. This expectation of excellence or difference can weigh on autistic people, and in particular autistic people of higher intelligence, leading to feelings of imposter syndrome, where we doubt our autism because we don't come across as outstanding or different enough. Okay, so returning to the concept of support levels in autism. The diagnostic outcome references the level of support that a newly diagnosed autistic person might require in two main categories. And to clarify here, this support level classification is two numbers and not just one. By this I mean to say that if an autistic person has level 1 support needs, for instance, that is only telling half the story at best. In reality, the support categories may be different for social communication and for rigid thinking and repetitive behaviours. For example, in my case, I have level 1 support needs for social communication and level 2 for rigid thinking and repetitive behaviours. And going a bit deeper, we also need to understand that these numbers are not static. You don't earn a support level and stay in that little box for life. What actually happens is our needs change on a daily basis depending on what is happening in every part of our lives at that moment in time. Sometimes, for instance, I might find social interaction more difficult than at other times, and this may mean that at that moment I need much more support than at other times. On those days, my support in that area might be considered substantial or level 2. Likewise, my repetitive behaviours or sensory sensitivities might be more acute than at other times, which might mean I require very substantial support or level 3 support at that time. Likewise, on other days when I am well supported and other external factors are not so prevalent, my support needs might be less, thus fitting more within the level 1 category. The general assumption within the wider community is that if an autistic person has a higher intelligence, then they require less support. This is how the original diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome was described. For someone to achieve this diagnosis, they would have had the same sort of social difficulties, sensory sensitivities and repetitive behaviours associated with autism, but with average to above average intelligence. It is also assumed that this also equated to a level 1 support needs classification, or in other words, low support needs or high functioning. Now, I can see the logic that says that higher IQ means less support would be needed, but the reality may actually be different. This is especially true as the category B, or rigid thinking and repetitive behaviours, including sensory sensitivities, actually has very little to do with high intelligence. All higher intelligence does for this area of autism is give a level of ability to mask the underlying challenges. Likewise, in the area of social communication, intelligence may just lead to more intense masking, which actually results in more significant internal challenges like shutdowns, meltdowns, burnout, or mental health challenges like anxiety, depression, or OCD. In fact, it has been shown that autistic people with higher IQs are actually more at risk of mental health challenges than autistic people with intellectual disability. Now, a footnote on Asperger's syndrome is the fact that it is no longer a currently used diagnosis. People who would have formerly been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome would now be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder level 1. So even this fact also talks to the point in that while Asperger's syndrome classifies autistic people relative to their level of intelligence, it also typically assumes level 1 or lower support needs. So, in summing up, the key points to take away are: intelligence alone is not a predictor for the support any autistic person may require. Autistic people with higher intelligence may also mask more comprehensively, which can cause more significant mental health challenges. Support levels are not static, but change constantly as our daily challenges ebb and flow. And stereotypes of autism can make the lives of autistic people, and particularly those of higher intelligence, more difficult. Okay, so I hope this has been useful. Feel free to chat more on this topic in the comments section, and please let me know if there are any future topics you would like me to cover. So until next time, bye for now.